Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today I thought we would continue with the leak series and having a look at Italy. Now, I know this leak list is going to disappoint a lot of people because it doesn't actually have a lot of Italian vehicles on it. But as we've talked about many times with Italy, one of the things that it desperately needs is non-Italian vehicles to make it more interesting. Just how the Finnish have gone into the Swedish, and the Norwegian have also gone into the Swedish, the South Africans going into the British. What Italy needs is a bunch of other vehicles from places like Hungary, Romania, to kind of spice up the life of the tech tree. And I also know that there's a lot of Italian vehicles that are left there waiting, and I'm sure in the future they will also come into the game. It's not as if War Thunder is going to die tomorrow. It's got a hell of a long lifespan ahead of it. The first vehicle is the 40M Turán I. Now, this vehicle is actually pretty interesting in its history, and it would take quite a long time to go through in a specific video. So I'd rather dedicate a whole video to this vehicle in the future when it is announced. I will say though, there's a really good tank encyclopedia article about this vehicle, going through its whole history, where it started from, how it got to be, and it's just really well made. I'll leave a link in the description to it, and if you aren't interested in reading it, there's a video attached on their general YouTube channel as well. So the 40M Turán is one of the first out of the Turán series. You basically had the Turán 1, 2, and 3. The Turán 1 was the original medium tank that they designed. It had access to the 40mm 41M L51. This wasn't that powerful. It had a decent muzzle velocity, but overall didn't pen too much. It also had access to 28mm Gebauer machine guns and also 260 horsepower engine, meaning that it wouldn't really go around too quickly since it was nearly 20 tons. This thing was basically built in 1941 to 1943. There was nearly 300 of them which were produced, and they found out even in 1941 that these guys weren't really up to snuff. They weren't being able to actually compete with the other vehicles that are around the place, meaning that drastic upgrades were needed, which is why you have a lot of the Turán series which is just hanging about. Another Hungarian is also there in the form of the 43M Turán III. As I talked about with the 40M Turán, one of the problems that it had is it was seen as underpowered in many different aspects. The Turán II, and especially the Turán III, was more designed to try and help those aspects and improve them to a decent standard. The problem was this was designed in 1943 to 44, it was produced in 1944 itself, and they only made a few of them. Basically, it was too late, and overall it didn't really do anything. It did have successful trials though. The variant itself was accepted into service, but it isn't known if this thing did or did not serve in combat. So it's kind of as simple as that. The main difference between the Turán 1 and 2 and the Turán 3 is the fact that the Turán 3 had access to the 43M 75mm L43, L46 or L55, depending on what you want to look at, since there was two of them which were produced. Basically, the 41M Turán was completely obsolete by the time of 1943, so they tried to add the Zrinyi assault guns to different design platforms, and also maybe adding in some of the German guns, but instead what ended up happening is two 43M 75mm tank guns were manufactured. These were built into what later would be the Turán 3, and then the Zrinyi 1, when we have one of the Zrinyis in the game, and it was basically developed off the 75mm from the Germans. So that's kind of the idea of it, so it would have a better gun. It was slightly heavier than the standard Turán, obviously because of the gun and the additional weight. It also had a 260 horsepower engine, so it was only going around at 12.5 horsepower per ton, which isn't terrible, but it's not great. It's less than the original Turán 1, which wasn't deemed very nimble. So overall, you're basically just getting an upgunned Turán with a pretty decent gun on it. I could easily see this thing coming to the game. The next vehicle is one which has been floating around for a long time, even since Italy was added to the game, and this is the semovente M4375 bersaglieri. Now, we already have the M4375 in the game, but the bersaglieri, would be a special one, and the main special thing about it is it had 3 machine guns on the top of it, and that's about it. If you don't know what the bersaglieri are, they are actually represented and enlisted in the Tunisia campaign. But basically, they are elite Italian troops. They're a troop of marksmen. They needed to be above standard in pretty much every way. So they were basically looking to be above average size and also stamina. They had to endure intense physical training and also qualify as a marksman. So these would be kind of your elite troopers. In the Second World War, there was a bunch of different bersaglieri regiments that were around, and they also fought after the armistice for both sides. So it's definitely a very interesting story with them. But these guys were all over the place. They were in North Africa, they were in France. Some of them even ended up on the Eastern Front of all places during of course, the Italian offensives over there, which aren't really talked about too much. My favorite thing about stuff like that is after the Italians went into the Eastern Front, they realized they really had nothing to do with the heavy armor there. So then that birthed stuff like the semovente 9053, which is always very fun. But yeah, at the end of the day, this is just a semovente with access to extra machine guns. But if you want some interesting stuff to read about, I think it is worth reading about the bersaglieri, because they just have so many big and interesting stories all over, not just the Second World War, but all over the place, since these guys were founded a very, very long time ago, basically created in 1836 by General Alessandro La Marmora. There's also another Hungarian vehicle, and this is the Zrinyi 2, the 4043M Zrinyi 2. Now this one is similar to the Zrinyi 1, which we have in game. The major difference is the gun that's on it. The Zrinyi was based off the Turán chassis, which, we talked about before. And basically, just like how you have the Stug and the Panzers, the Zrinyi was the Stug compared to the Turán. So the Zrinyi itself was developed mainly in 1942. They basically had a look at stuff like the Stug 3 and was like, oh, that's doing pretty well. Maybe we should try our own little thing. You got to remember, the Stug 3 was one of the most successful vehicles for the Germans. It was one of the most efficient ones when it came to the war and how it was generally used. Hungary actually attempted to negotiate with Germany to try and actually acquire some Stug 3s at the time, but unfortunately they didn't receive enough to be able to really push forward with it. So they decided, hey, you know what, we'll just make our own. The problem with that is, if you know anything about the Hungarian production facilities and also some of their other issues during the Second World War, then you'll understand why this didn't really go so well. The vehicle itself was designed from 42 to 43, and it was produced from 43 to 44. They made a decent amount, about 70 odd of the vehicle itself. And when you had the Zrinyi 1, which we have in game, it was obviously armed with the 43M 75mm, which is quite nice and all. But then, when you have a look at the Zrinyi 2, it actually was armed with a howitzer. It had itself a 105mm Mavag 4043M on it. So, very similar to how you have the Stug and the Stu, the Zrinyi 2 is similar to the Stu in that regard. So it would have a 105mm, which would probably have access to some pretty interesting rounds, and it would be used for, of course, infantry support in general. Unfortunately, the actual tank itself, or the SPG itself, didn't do very well. It had great army trials, just like all of the other Hungarian vehicles. They just came in way too late when it came to the thing. In January 1944, they ordered 50 more vehicles, and 20 of these rolled out of the factories between March and July. And then on the 27th of July, after 6 new vehicles were finished in the morning, there was an aircraft raid on the factory. So around 20 semi-finished Zrinyi 105s were saved, and at least 6 of them were rebuilt, and therefore a total of 72 of them were produced. They didn't have a huge impact on the war, though. Hungary still got rolled, but c'est la vie. At least it would be another vehicle for War Thunder. The last vehicle for the Italians would be another Albatros class. Now, we already have an Albatros in the game. It is the Albatros F543, but this one specifically would be the F544. The F544 is the Alcyon, where the Albatros is the 543. The major difference between them is the Albatros was stricken in 1989 and the Alcyon was stricken in 1991. One of the interesting things about this Corvette series was, even though it was designed and built in Italy in the 50s, it was actually paid for by the US, and they were operated by a bunch of different countries. So Italy, Denmark, Indonesia, and also the Netherlands at the same time, which is always kind of interesting. My feeling about the Alcyon is it will probably end up being a premium or something like that, similar to what we see from other vehicles, such as one of the oncoming Gabbiano classes, which is going to be a premium for the Italian tech tree. This one will probably be similar. It has access to 440mm L70 Bofors, insanely strong armament overall, and also has access to some pretty interesting torpedoes, which have a very unique launching mechanism, and a few other things as well. But basically what you are is a rapid fire machine which can do a ton of damage over a small period of time. And overall, 8 of them were completed in the 50s. They were used into the 90s, some of them, and they all were retired. Not a single one was lost in active service, which is pretty impressive, especially, well, even in what would be classed as not the, the non-war periods for a lot of these countries. Usually something happens like an accident or even a small skirmish or sabotage, but with these guys, they all were built, they all did very good service, and they all survived, which is pretty impressive. So those are the vehicles that were leaked for Italy. Not a ton of actual Italian vehicles, but you know how it is. Hopefully at some point Italy becomes more of a universal tree, so people can enjoy it even more. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank Forge, Siegebreak, Carrion Crow, Nicholas Richardson, Elove Goat, Pyman, Winter Scientist, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie, B. Young, and also Sem Arslan, Wilkski, Uncle Bean, Derek R., Bareen, Lafouche, and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.